Welcome back to Nebraska Farmcast from the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Ryan Evans, and really glad on this episode to be joined again by Dr. Brad Lubben, an ag policy specialist with UNL Center for Ag Profitability, to break down the massive reconciliation bill, officially the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was signed into law earlier this month, bringing significant new support for farmers and ranchers. And while the headlines have focused on tax changes and cuts to social programs, the sweeping legislation quietly delivered some of the most substantial updates to farm programs in years. From increased safety net protections to enhanced crop insurance and disaster assistance, Brad is here to get us up to speed as he has written about the new legislation in his latest policy report column for Nebraska Farmer magazine. Brad, thanks so much for joining me again.
Good to be with you, Ryan.
Well, the passage of the new reconciliation bill has brought, as I mentioned, significant and maybe somewhat surprising farm program increases and other changes to ag.
Well, in fact, much of what producers have been asking for in terms of new farm legislation and a new farm bill, and the things that we couldn't get done the last couple of years in a formal farm bill debate, actually found their way into the reconciliation bill. Changes to the commodity program safety net, changes to crop insurance and disaster assistance programs, and some other additional items throughout the farm legislation were a big plus up here for producers in this reconciliation bill.
What are the updates specifically to ARC and PLC in the new legislation, and what do those changes mean for Nebraska's crop producers?
Well, producers have been asking for updates to the protection levels in both the price loss coverage PLC program and the agricultural risk coverage ARC programs. Those programs were introduced all the way back in 2014, and they have almost effectively become the semi-permanent farm bill since that time. But some of the legislation is dated, at least, or the protection levels are dated relative to the kinds of prices and production cost levels that we see today. And so calls for increases to those safety nets were heeded, and there is a substantial bump up in the safety net. For the PLC program, for example, the statutory reference prices generally climb from 10 to 20%. Use corn as an example for the state of Nebraska, and you have a $3.70 per bushel reference price that climbs to $4.10 per bushel. Well, on the face of it, that doesn't sound like maybe much significant because we're in the mid $4 range, maybe on current price expectations. But it's not just the statutory price that was increased. It was also the formula that says the effective reference price is a function of the statutory price or 88% of the moving average instead of 85. You do all those calculations and you increase the cap, and ultimately the reference price for 2025 moves from what would have been $4.26 a bushel under the existing effective reference price formula to $4.42 a bushel under this new calculation. So there's a substantial bump up in that reference price again, and compare $4.42 to the statutory price that we had previously at $3.70, and we're talking about a dramatic increase in ultimately the protection for producers. That's true in almost every commodity we see. And take soybeans, for example, we're moving from a $9.66 reference price for 2025 to an $11.50 reference price that will replace the safety net here in 2025. That's the PLC side of the equation. There's also the agricultural risk coverage, the ARC side of the equation. That protection has been at 86%, covering a 10% band of revenue losses, effectively from 86 down to 76. This legislation increases that safety net to a 90% protection level and a 12% revenue band. So effectively from 90% down to 78% in terms of protection. Both ARC and PLC offer more protection now going forward than they did previously, given the changes in this legislation.
And these ARC and PLC changes are immediately in effect, correct?
Importantly, yes. These are changes that are to take effect for the 2025 crop year, which obviously we're well into already. Producers already made an enrollment decision for 25, but we won't be going back to recalculate and make a new ARC versus PLC decision. The legislation wrote in here a one-time sort of free pass that says the program will simply pay the higher of ARC or PLC to producers this year. The decision between ARC and PLC would return next year in 2026. But for the present year, we've passed legislation well into the year, and we're just simply going to bump up the support levels to the higher of.
What should producers know about changes to crop insurance programs?
Well, we've always sort of tried to educate that for producers, it's both the combination of commodity program support and crop insurance protection that matter, how you bundle them or how you manage them to complement each other. And here too, on the crop insurance side, we see some increased federal support for the premium subsidy. So we've bumped up the average premium subsidy from about 3 to 5%, 3 to 5 percentage points. And so producers will see more affordable buy-up protection levels or buy-up protection premiums. We also see an increase in the supplemental coverage option. That's that county-based supplemental policy that one can add on top of their individual policy. It sort of mimicked ARC in terms of the protection level it provided. And in fact, it is increased to 90% as well, which means it may again look much like ARC, protecting you as a county-based insurance policy from 90% down to whatever insurance level you buy. Now, historically, if you were participating in ARC, you could not participate in SCO because they do look very similar. But ARC is this formula tied to a moving average revenue stream. SCO is this formula tied to current year's price levels and price guarantees. They are distinct in how they work, and producers will have the option going forward of considering SCO even if they are also enrolled in ARC. So it's not just ARC versus PLC plus the possibility of SCO. SCO is an option for producers regardless of which one they chose.
And how about on the livestock side for provisions that may be affecting ranchers?
Yeah, there too we see some increases in the safety net. And here we have to remember there's a third leg of that safety net. It's not just commodity programs and crop insurance, it's also disaster assistance. And the standing disaster assistance programs that were permanently authorized in previous Farm Bill legislation remain, but they see some improvements as well. The livestock indemnity program that covers mortality losses increases the payment rate for those mortality losses that are subject to predator loss from federally protected species. Particularly think of the reintroduction of wolves in the Rocky Mountain region and the potential livestock losses accordingly. That's the kind of loss here we're talking about. But in the livestock forage disaster program that covers grazing losses due to drought, we previously had a payment rate, a single month payment rate based on how many weeks of drought at the level of D2 or worse. Well, we've increased that potential payment. So there's a 1 month payment rate if D2 drought shows up for any 4 consecutive weeks. And there is a 2 month payment if D2 drought shows up for any 7 of 8 consecutive weeks. So effectively, it's an increased, it's a new threshold, a lower threshold for potential assistance payments, and an increased payment rate for some of those drought conditions. So all in all, continued increases in improvement for producers in terms of both commodity programs, crop insurance programs, and disaster assistance programs.
And again, the scope of this legislation is just massive. So what other changes impacting agriculture are important to understand?
Well, there are certainly other parts of farm legislation that matter here as well. There are elements in there for conservation programs that take some one-time authorization from the previously named Inflation Reduction Act and transfer it into sort of baseline program support in the farm legislation itself. There are some additions in trade promotion. There are additions in ag research, but there are sort of plus-ups or increases in support throughout much of the key and core programs of traditional farm legislation. It's not everything, but there's a substantial amount of increased support throughout here, mostly for the ag community.
Well, as you mentioned, it seems like ag got much of what it had been asking for recently in this legislation, but we know many other programs experienced cuts, including SNAP food assistance program benefits. And as you point out in your column for Nebraska Farmer, these two interests, farm and nutrition, they've long been tied together to create a coalition to help get farm bills across the congressional finish line for decades. So what impact could this sudden shift in funding have on this coalition between farm and nutrition, and how legislation is negotiated going forward?
You described that as I wrote about it. It seems like agriculture got much or even most of what it really hoped for with new legislation. It got increased farm program support. It got some increased and improved certainty and conservation funding in other areas. It also saw, rather importantly, some substantial tax policy changes that would extend some of the 2017 tax legislation. It saw some bioenergy policy and tax incentive policy for renewable fuels that would help support the sector. Ag got much of what it might have asked for in terms of a farm bill or other related federal legislation. Almost like it's Christmas in July, if you're familiar with one of the popular jingles from a local Lincoln, Nebraska area commercial. Ag got much of what it asked for, even as other organizations or other sectors and other programs took some rather dramatic cuts, particularly the food assistance components of what traditionally has been a farm and food farm bill. While the ag commodity programs and ag support saw increases of 60 billion or more over 10 years, the food assistance program saw cuts of nearly 200 billion over that same time frame. And while much of the focus might have been on how to reform the program and rectify certain eligibility rules or payment calculations and other fraud or waste and abuse, it fundamentally still amounts to a cut in food assistance spending, which leave a lot of people in the traditional farm and food coalition wondering how the farm side got a substantial increase while the food side took a major cut. That's traditionally the coalition that both sides had to win to get a farm bill across the finish line. Well, we went through the reconciliation process here, and that required only a majority vote to get it to the finish line. So both sides didn't have to win specifically this time. But it's unclear what that means for the future, because we still have some farm bill programs and issues to resolve. Not everything could be addressed through the reconciliation process and the funding component of it. So there are still policy issues relating to the underlying farm bill that are still due to expire this September unless they're addressed. And trying to determine the either the willingness or the attitude for some sort of bipartisan political policy development here going into the fall is a really interesting question right now.
That's Dr. Brad Lubben, an Extension and Ag Policy Specialist with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Agricultural Profitability. And we've been talking about the new reconciliation bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was recently passed at the beginning of July 2025. Brad has written about that in detail in his latest policy report column for Nebraska Farmer, which you can find linked to in the notes to this podcast, as well as on our center's website at cap.unl.edu. Brad, I really appreciate all the information and your time today.
Well, thank you, Ryan, very much for the opportunity to visit about this. It's rather dramatic how it all came about, including marathon sessions in both the House and the Senate. But ultimately, we do have this One Big Beautiful Bill Act across the finish line with some substantial changes for agriculture.
Thank you again, Brad, and we'll talk to you again soon. Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.